afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Public Health Practice Grand Rounds. My name is Molly Mitchell, and on behalf of the Mid-Atlantic Public Health Training Center and the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation on Surfing for Thinness, research on pro-eating disorder websites. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to invite you to visit our online trainings that are available on our website, including many of our archived webcasts. So be sure to tell people who may have missed today's presentation, we will have this archived on our website in about a week or so. And you can see any other webcasts, webinars that we've done are on our website, as well as our training on public health nursing. We do have some face-to-face trainings coming up that you should be aware of, including achieving outcomes through best process program design and implementation on December 9th, as well as a grant writing workshop on December 2nd, and public health problem solving in January. Also, for those watching online, we welcome you to email questions for our presenters at any time during today's broadcast by simply clicking on that link that you'll find right there on the webpage. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speakers. Dina Borzakowski is an internationally recognized expert in the area of children, media, and health, and an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society. Dr. Borzakowski completed her graduate work in developmental psychology at Harvard University and did postdoctorate work in health communication at Stanford University. Also, Dr. Borzakowski worked in the world of children's television on shows including Sesame Street, Degrassi Junior High, and Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? Dr. Borzakowski's domestic and international research involves studying how youth come to use media and how media has an impact on the well-being of children and adolescents. Presently, Dr. Borzakowski is an NIH-funded researcher and is doing laboratory-based research examining individuals' strategies and success in finding online health information. Also, Dr. Borzakowski leads several international evaluations of communication campaigns and interventions. She is now working with MTV's Social Responsibility Division, investigating how media can influence sexual behaviors and attitudes among 15 to 24-year-olds in Trinidad and Tobago, Kenya, and Zambia. Our second speaker today is Dr. Rebecca Peebles. Dr. Peebles is an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Adolescent Medicine at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Her research focuses on the health outcomes of disordered eating and obesity in young people and how the internet can act as a vector to help and harm adolescents as they try to approach a healthy weight. She attended medical school at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio and completed her pediatrics training at the Cleveland Clinic and her adolescent medicine fellowship at Stanford University, where she served as an instructor until 2010. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Borzakowski. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be giving this talk this afternoon, and even more so to be doing it with Rebecca, because we don't get to talk in person live together that often. So it's a nice opportunity. Today, I'm going to be talking about a content analysis that we conducted on pro-eating disorder websites. But this comes out of my own work, and as the bio said, I study the impact of media on kids and how kids come to use media. And when one does that, sometimes you have really good media and sometimes you have really terrible media out there. And I actually believe that there are both. I think that you can come across great content and it can have a really positive impact on the health of children and adolescents, and also there's some pretty cruddy stuff out there too. You know, there are now web communities out there that are encouraging all sorts of unhealthy behaviors, and such as self-injury and cutting, suicide and violence. And pro-eating disorder websites are really a collection of internet pages that deliver messages through text, images, video, etc., that encourage knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors to achieve terribly low body weights. These are not your typical diet or exercise websites, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So this study came out of this desire to sort of understand and know more about how these websites had an impact or what they were all about, to be able to understand what the impact of these websites are. Guiding this are two theories. One is Bandura's social cognitive theory, and the other is George Gerbner's cultivation theory. Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory, in this case, suggests that the modeled behaviors that one might see on these websites would encourage those who see them to imitate them, especially if they can relate to the modeled behaviors or the model and have a concept that they're being rewarded. So when someone is repeatedly exposed to images of successful models and celebrities with really life-threateningly low body weights, those viewers are more likely to engage in those behaviors. George Gerbner's cultivation theory posits that when messages are pervasive and repeated, individuals with higher exposure are going to accept those messages as more normative. So this theory suggests that the person who's having repeated exposure to extreme dieting and exercise messages is going to see those as what's typical out there and not, as extreme. The purpose of this study that I'm going to talk about was to conduct an in-depth examination of pro-eating disorder websites and the messages to which users may be exposed. It's a content analysis, meaning we're looking at what's out there. So in doing that, we want to be able to present what's a valid depiction of what visitors would encounter. Let me make a side note here, though, that this came out of a student's interest in this. A student named Summer Schenkt, she's now Summer Schenkt Andrus, was an MPH student here. And we met early on when she got here. We talked about her interest in these websites. I knew that Rebecca was doing some work on this. And we really, with Summer's impetus and stimulus on this, kept going through this and really completed this project, which says that if you're an MPH student looking for a capstone or another project, don't hesitate to come up to me, because Summer certainly got a lot out of this project, including a published paper. In doing this, we used a methodology that would be extremely inclusive. So we had around 15, this was done in 2007, 2008, 2007. We used around 15 pro-eating disorder related terms, and we tried two approaches because at that time it wasn't exclusively Google. Yahoo was pretty big out there as well. And we generated, using these different related terms, URL addresses. We excluded the duplications and had around 302 unique URLs. And we had our inclusion criteria were websites that reflect an eating disorder information, their blogs, their journals, their home pages. We also made sure that we only looked at English language ones. We excluded medical reference sites, professional organizations, people who were news articles that were about eating disorders. We excluded that. So we wound up having around 220 websites. And when we went to actually go do the content analysis, already 40 of them had been shut down. And that's an interesting issue with this doing a content analysis, is you sort of almost have to grab a snapshot, because especially with the web, it's changing so quickly that it's almost, we did this really quickly and still we lost around 40 to shut down websites. A team of around 6 public health students and adolescent health researchers helped develop the protocols and the coding book for this. We looked at around 6 categories. We looked at website logistics, which are general items about information about the website, such as web warnings and disclaimers, and the information about who created the website. We looked at accessories, website accessories, and these are items that you would commonly find on websites such as BMI calculators and ways to collect your own caloric intake and information like that. A hot thing we were looking at were Thinspiration tips and techniques, and these are items that would help motivate and encourage particular behaviors among people who would come across the information. We also wanted to look at recovery information. Were there items providing information or support getting help to not continue these behaviors? We looked at perceived themes, mainly because there had been small studies, content analyses done before us that were suggesting that there were common themes out there, such as control, success, transformation, solidarity, revolution. And the last thing we coded for was perceived harm. And this was a little bit controversial because it was pretty subjective. But we wanted to get a sense of, is there a feeling that you get out of these sites? You know, are some, because you see some of them, they don't seem too dangerous, they don't seem too harmful. Could we categorize this? And once you did that categorization, was that associated with other things? So we had, a scale that went from 1 to 5, and our coders would see, not too harmful, may have recovery information, down to very dangerous and could do immediate harm. So let me get at our results. So again, the content analysis includes data from 180 websites. 84% had pro-ANA content, and 63% had pro-MIA. Pro-ANA being pro-anorexia, and pro-MIA being pro-bulimia information in a very overt manner. Another 31% had a substantial amount of pro-recovery information. And as you can see from this, there was a combination thing. In general, sites would have pro-ANA and pro-MIA information. In fact, only 17% of the pro-ANA websites were exclusively pro-ANA. 2% of the pro-MIA websites were just pro-MIA websites. Looking at the logistics, we sort of tried to get at, as I said, we tried to figure out who was creating these. Only half of the websites even had any sort of sense of a biography of the webmaster. Nearly all of these from this sample seemed to be female. And, again, you're almost taking some guess here because, here's the about me, and it says a little bit about skinny girl. So we're assuming this is a female. They go on to write, and I know it's a little bit hard to read here, but she says, I am in my early 20s. Okay? So we could code that as someone who is not an adolescent, but older. And in fact, we saw that 16% of the ones that said who the maintainer were adolescents, and around 2/3, 66%, were from young adults. Another 18%, by the way, were older adults. Around 80% of the websites had the ability to allow you to contact the webmaster. 55% gave an email contact, and around 31% had an automatic but anonymous system. Again, it's hard to see here, but on this website you could see you keep telling me to email you. How is such a thing possible? So if you look in the text, it says there, if you can decipher this, girl@skinnygossip.com, then you can get in touch. It's scrambled to help reduce spam. Okay. When we looked at the site accessories, we saw that there was a lot of nutritional information and charts on caloric intake and expenditure were regularly included. A lot of the websites had more interactive features, a good substantial amount. Let me show you an example of what we mean by this interactive. So here's a website, and you can see that there are calculators here. Let's go to one. How much weight will you lose per day, week, if you eat blank calories each day? So you click on this, and we could say we're female, what's our weight? For this sake, we'll say we're 145 pounds. How many calories do you plan to eat each day? Oh, well, I'm going to be on this really strict diet. I'm going to eat only 800 calories a day. So you put that in. What's your age? I'll be 29 for the moment. Height, 5'4", that's 64 inches. Yeah, in fact, I probably am a sedentary couch potato. But if I submit this, you see that they have these website accessories where you could say, okay, well, if I do this diet and I want to weigh, let's say, 104 pounds, I can be that by April 20th if I keep on this diet. So these are the type of calculators you could find out there. Oops. Go back to here. Oops. Oh, sorry. Again, another thing we coded for were Thinspiration tips and techniques. 85% of the websites included Thinspiration, and these again are images, audio, video intended to inspire weight loss. Since this lecture is around the lunchtime hour, I tried to not have really stark and scary looking pictures, but let me show you a couple of examples. Let's try this again. Okay, have I frozen the machine? I might have frozen this. Let's just end that process and I'll just tell you what. Okay. I might need some help here.
Go to applications up there.
Yeah, and just, well, sorry.
Yes, I guess if we close down Loser Town.
Yeah, that's the one that I think.
Is that the one causing the problem, do you think?
Not sure.
And then end task.
Well, close down everything but. Okay. Okay, quick. We need to go back to mine. Is it?
Yeah, that's on the desktop.
Yep. Okay, let me just go down to it. I'm going to try one more time and see if this goes up, because it did work before. Okay, here are some examples of Thinspiration. And again, these are pictures of models that people post. Often they're celebrities. Celebrities appeared on 57% of the websites. We got really a little tired of seeing a lot of Lindsay Lohan, and she's on a lot of the websites. But these are examples of Thinspiration pictures that you can look at and remind yourself to stay on your, 500 to 800 calorie diet. And honestly, these are pretty calm. We also looked at tips and techniques that were being suggested on the different websites. Around 74% of the websites included diet, behavior tips. Another 50% of the websites had information about purging and ways to purge. Interestingly, around 43% of the websites gave information about hiding your eating disorder from other people. Let me show you examples of tips in dieting. So here's just a page. Number 12, for example, wear a rubber band around your wrist and snap it when you want to eat. You'll train yourself not to think about eating. Number 18, eat in front of a mirror. Hell, eat in front of a mirror naked and see how much you want to eat then. Some other tips. Don't eat in front of television or on the bed or on the computer. Concentrate on the food while you eat. You get more satisfied. So you can see some of these are almost logical kind of tips, and some of them are a little bit harder. Eat vegetarian as much as possible. They make all fake meats and cheeses now. But then again, it does go to, gives information about, there are tips about how you can be on a 3-day fast. Let's see. Never eat in secret, the worst habit to get into. So those are examples of tips. A common feature on many of the sites was the inclusion of recovery information and recovery-oriented information or advice. In our sample, 38% of the websites included or contained recovery information or links about other sites. 21% featured specific sections devoted exclusively to recovery. This is a website that we've been looking at over the years called Cerulean Butterfly. What's interesting about this website is it started out being really quite dramatic and quite harmful. And now, if you look at it, they're about a positive, loving, peaceful individuals who are struggling with their eating disorders. So you can see there's almost been a change in this one, where in the past it wasn't including as much recovery information, but now it does. And in fact, this is an example of one that has, if you look on the sidebar here, topics, and it does have a website, it does have a page only about recovery. So here it talks about first things first and treatment and where you can go and support groups. So here it is on a pro-anorexia, pro-ED website, a whole page about where you could get information about recovery. Again, going back to the idea of themes, around 83% of the websites had some sort of address the theme of success. All of these themes were actually common, and there would be multiple themes on a website. Interestingly enough, one of the ones that people were worried about, revolution. So we can choose to live as victims in a helpless, hopeless victim mentality, and we can choose to stand up and fight and take action, take control, make things happen. This was actually only found on 6% of the websites. This idea of we're going to start a new revolution about being pro-ED. Lastly, we talked about this idea of perceived harm. We had these 5 categories. In our sample, around 28% we categorized as a 1. 27% as a 2, 22% as a 3, 18% as a 4, and only 6% really hit that 5 mark. We combined the scores to have a low, medium, and high. And in fact, there are some interesting patterns across these. So among our low perceived harm ones, 0% declared anorexia as a lifestyle choice, whereas those in the high perceived harm, around a quarter of those did, 26%. But what's interesting is if you look down on the recovery information, this wasn't significantly different. So you might find recovery information on the low perceived harm, but you also found it on the medium and the high perceived harm. Hiding, for example, if you look in the hiding an eating disorder, that's an interesting one. For the low perceived harm, that was only 11% of the websites had that. 48%, half of the medium ones, and 77% of the high ones had that as a theme. So in conclusion, I want to talk about that there are some mixed messages here. You're getting some really negative messages about extreme dieting and exercise, but you're also getting some positive ones suggesting, this is a disorder that you need to get treatment for and you can get help. There's also an issue about fact versus fiction. You know, if you're a young person looking at these websites and you're looking at the tips, it's really hard to tell what is a valid piece of advice and what isn't. As I was doing this, I actually looked at this page. This is from a women's magazine. It's called Women's Fitness, and this is a pretty standard diet and exercise website. And this one goes on to describe how you can go about doing a fast. So this one wouldn't have made it into our sample. But in fact, if you look at some of the websites out there, you're getting some really extreme messages about dieting even on these sites. You know, what is your biggest weight loss goal? Is it 5 to 25 pounds? Is it 50 pounds? And, you know, Jillian's going to help you do that with, you know, if you subscribe to her. But again, there's a whole page about fasting, but it's not even on a ProED website. Lastly, there's the issue of the ever-changing technology. We did this study in 2007, 2008. We finally got it published in 2009. But in terms of health communication, that, you know, we need to be on top of these even faster because the technology is changing. These are websites. I think things have moved on to Twitter. They've moved on to Facebook. And it'll be curious to see in a year from now where these types of messages are and to study that. And then the next steps, which Rebecca's now going to go on and tell more about, is, okay, so now we know what's out there. What is the impact of this? And that's a really hard study to do because you can't exactly go into your typical high school and say, okay, we're going to do a case control trial here. You know, we're going to have control kids and then we're going to have treatment kids, and all of you guys are going to have to go to these websites 3 or 4 times a week, and we'll see what happens. You can't, the IRB wouldn't let you do that study. But Rebecca's come up with some really great ways to do that, so I'm going to pass the mic on to her. Get all these down.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rebecca Peoples from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and thanks, Dina, for that great presentation. Let's see. All right, so I'm just going to set up my slideshow here. Okay. So what's important to remember, first of all, is that there are pro-risk behavior websites of all different kinds and of flavors. So just to name a few, you know, pro-eating disorder websites are not the only ones out there. Dina studies these all the time, but there are, you know, pro-smoking websites, pro-drug use websites. The pro-suicide websites are really scary, actually. And one that has a lot of overlap, a family of websites that have a lot of overlap with the eating disorder websites are self-injury websites and pro-self-injury websites. So I wanted to bring that up because you'll hear me reference pro-SI, and I mean pro-self-injury websites. These are what they sound like. They're websites that promote or discuss or provide a forum for individuals who engage in self-injury to discuss their behaviors. Similar to pro-eating disorder websites, that doesn't always mean that they're discussing ways of promoting those behaviors. Sometimes they're discussing ways of stopping yourself from those behaviors. And there is sort of some ambivalence there, and there's differences in the content between sites. But bottom line, the sites are often pretty graphic. They do discuss self-harm, and there's a huge overlap in content with pro-ED sites. There are also these pro-recovery sites, and that's what I get these questions all the time in my line of work where people say, you know, well, we should make a website to counter these pro-eating disorder websites. That would be great. Let's do that. But the problem is that there's been no literature really on the impact of pro-recovery websites either, and there are some drawbacks to those. So they sound like such a nice idea, but first of all, there are far fewer of them. They tend to be institutionally related, like created by an institution as opposed to some cool kid on the internet. The content thus is a lot less current and grabs you a lot less frequently. And as they sound like, they do promote recovery from an eating disorder, which is good, but in doing so, they often, if they're a full-fledged pro-recovery site, they discourage pro-ED postings, which what that means is if you suffer from an eating disorder, most days, you are going online to try to find supporting, you may say, gosh, I had such a tough day, I purged or whatever, and you will often then be censored from the websites. And so there's difficulties with that about what kind of content is appropriate to share, what kind of content isn't, what's too triggering for other people, what's not. But the bottom line is that many people who actively suffer from an eating disorder and thus could potentially use such a recovery forum actually really don't end up feeling comfortable going to them because they can't talk about their struggle with their disease very openly. So the reason we sort of care about these, just to do a very brief overview, you guys know most of this, but 50% of children and adolescents seek health information online. Almost all youth have gone online at some point, and studies from the Kaiser Family Foundation are pretty clear that now there are no differences between ethnic groups, socioeconomic strata, parental education level. Kids of all sorts go online these days. And we've done a study on homeless kids. 99% of them access the internet regularly. A third of kids, when they go online, pretend to be older. Only a quarter of kids report any type of parental restriction. So the internet is just an enormous forum for young people to get information, and many do change their behavior as a result of the information, and there's this perception that the information they're getting online is accurate somehow. Of internet health searchers, half are looking for ways to lose weight, and 25% are seeking information specifically about eating disorders. I first became interested in ProED websites because I had a patient who was a 17-year-old anorexic or former anorexic who was, by all our conventional medical terms, recovered. She had resumed her menses. She was back in school. She was getting along with her family. She was in outpatient therapy, no longer hospitalized. She reported that her peer group had some issues with eating disorders and cutting, but honestly, almost all my patients have a peer group that have difficulties with eating disorders and cutting, so that didn't necessarily leap out at me. But it wasn't until the parents really came in very concerned because she was just intensely preoccupied with eating disorders on the web and seeking out information in chat rooms on the internet many, many hours of every day. And so then I spoke with her directly about it. And it turned out that she actually ran one of the largest and most heavily frequented pro-anorexia websites at the time, with over 500,000 hits at that time. And she had set up a whole business where she sold artwork through the internet, through an online vendor, had a PO box, paid for the website. I mean, it was really impressive how she had orchestrated all of this. But it was also impressive to me that my normal sort of medical model of what was recovered was not really congruent with what she was struggling with. We know that these websites are becoming more prevalent in terms of how often they're frequented by children. In Belgium, actually, 711 Belgian school children were studied in grades 7, 9, and 11, and 12.6% of girls and 6% of boys had visited ProED websites. So that's really actually a high percentage for young kids in a small country like Belgium, where you wouldn't always think that that's like the most common place for ProED, but actually some of these European countries it's even more common than here. 16% of 9th and 11th grade girls were visiting these websites on a regular basis. In girls, visitation of these websites was associated with an increased drive for thinness, increased sense of perfectionism, worsened body perception, a higher BMI, and we'll get to that later, and a higher grade level. So those kids that were a little older and weighed a little more were more likely to be visiting. We also know that there are other studies that have shown that participants exposed to a mock ProED site for 25 minutes, similar to what Tina brought up. These were college students, and yeah, there was a mock website set up, and then the control was like sort of just a generic fashion site. And the people exposed to a ProED site for 25 minutes did show a greater negative affect, perceived themselves as heavier, and were more likely to exercise and think about weight. And this was after just 25 minutes of exposure. ProED visitors have also been shown in another college study to have higher body dissatisfaction, restriction, and bulimic activity than controls, but not different in incidence from visitors to these professional websites or pro-recovery websites that I mentioned before. We did a pilot study back in 2004 that came out in 2006, and just looking at eating disorder website usage in our patient population, so in our clinical population. It was a small sample, maybe 155 subjects. We were able to look at parent-patient pairs in an anonymous way. So both parents and patients participated, and we had an anonymous way of linking their responses, but they hadn't seen each other's. What was interesting about this, I mean, it was mostly a descriptive study, but 96% of our patients who visited ProED websites stated that they had learned new weight loss or purging techniques on those sites. 2/3 of them had used such techniques, and 1/3 of them had used new diet pills, laxatives, or supplements. However, we also asked all the parallel questions about pro-recovery sites as well, and those didn't come out unscathed. About half of kids had learned new weight loss or purging techniques from pro-recovery sites. 1/3 had used those techniques, and about 1/5 had used new diet pills, laxatives, or supplements. Interestingly, so the parents of kids who used pro-eating disorder websites were more likely to be concerned about the information their kids got from the web. They were more likely to know about ProED sites, just to know what they were even, and to have even gone to them themselves to check them out. But still, over half the parents whose own kids used these sites on a regular basis didn't know that their kids were using the sites. So despite being more internet savvy, more savvy about this particular phenomenon of ProED websites, still the majority of them didn't know that their own kids were visiting them. We then have conducted a study, and Dina's been involved in this study, trying to look a little bit more at outcomes in a creative way, trying to get around some of the ethical dilemmas inherent in studying this. So first of all, just finding the sites is a dilemma, and Dina already went through that. We used a similar methodology where we searched for Pro-Ana or Pro-Mia on Google and Yahoo. We took the first 35 pages of results and we went to every single site, and we didn't, you can't just decide to include sites that openly declare that they're pro-eating disorder, because many sites are smart enough not to declare that because they'll be shut down. So we instead developed some criteria for what meant a website with pro-eating disorder content. And that was that either the site maintainer indicated that their site was pro-ED, or if it had Thinspiration, tips and tricks sections, triggering, obviously overtly triggering material, or a disclaimer stating, many of these sites have a disclaimer like, do not enter here if you have an eating disorder, this is a dangerous site, it could be dangerous to you. And so if it met any of those criteria, then we looked at the site. If we looked at that site, we would also look at the first generation of links. So we would go to many of these sites have a resource link list of other websites people might find interesting, and we would look at all those links as well. We also at the time went to what were common web brings then. Facebook wasn't up yet, Zanga, LiveJournal, and MySpace, and we included any web brings we found on those sites if they met the same criteria, and then they had to have 500 or more members, because there were just thousands of those web brings that came up and we had to cut it down somehow. So what we found was that 550 sites met those criteria. We excluded 179 because they were either inactive or not in English, shut down, had very little pro-ED content in that they were just being constructed, like there was just very little content period on them. So there were 371 sites that were eligible, and we tried to contact all of them. 75 sites could not be contacted, one, because we were only IRB approved to contact sites where the maintainer was 18 or older, or certainly where they weren't declaring that they were under 18. Okay. And so 16, the maintainer was under 18. 3, the maintainer specifically had stated they didn't want to be contacted by researchers, so we respected that. 1 maintainer had passed away, and 55 sites had no means of contact. So after that, we ended up contacting 296 sites. We contacted the maintainers of all of those sites, and we asked them to post a link to our survey. We obviously had a long letter that we sent to them explaining the purpose of why we were trying to study. We were very upfront about this. We felt that that was important. There are some studies that go on where people try to sort of lurk on these websites and study them that way. I felt ethically concerned about that way of going about this. So we sent an open letter explaining why we thought it was important to understand more. we were really surprised in that the huge majority of the maintainers felt the same. They really wanted to know what impact their site was having. They actually wanted to have a positive impact, and they wanted to know more. We got 1,456 responses in less than 6 weeks. We also tracked the hits because you can't really do a response rate, a typical response rate for an online survey. So we tracked the hits to our study website, and through that we have sort of a proxy response rate of 43.6%. At the end of this long survey, we asked people to fill out online, which they really generously did. We also asked them at the very end if they lied on the survey. And then if they said yes, we asked, if yes, did you lie about your age, your weight, or other? And anyone that reported lying about their age, the results were not analyzed because we were only approved to do 18 or older. So as a result, basically we analyzed information about 1,291 subjects. 97% of these reported themselves to be female, 10% were married, 60% were in school, 27% worked, and only 3% sort of did a combination. The majority were Caucasian, but we did have some non-Caucasian users, 6% Hispanic Latino, 3% Asian, nearly 3% Black, and nearly 2% American Indian, Alaskan Native. And you can see the others there. What was interesting here is that, the age range was, sorry, let me use the mouse. The age range was pretty wide. I was surprised by that. So it ranged from 18 to 53 years old for a reported age range of the users, with an average squarely in the young adult range. But there definitely were some older users. The average BMI was normal. And so despite that, I think a lot of the media portrayals of these sites portray really cachectic young girls using these sites, at least in this survey, by reported BMI. And honestly, my experience with these users are that they're very accurate to a fault about reporting their BMI. I have no reason not to trust this number, that their average BMI was normal. So then we also asked them what their sort of highest BMI at their current height had ever been and their lowest. And many of them had been overweight at some point in time. Many of them had been underweight at some point in time. You can see here that the average percent ideal body mass index that they had at their lowest weight ever at the current height was, some people ranged 44 and then up to 233%. And they reported an average age of onset of their eating disorder at 14 years of age. This is a little bit more about the BMI distribution, just to bring home that a little over half were in this healthy BMI range as defined by the CDC. A quarter were underweight, in that sort of more of the population that you picture from media portrayals of these sites. And another approximate quarter of users were overweight or obese. We gave them a standardized measure called the EDEQ. That's an eating disorder exam questionnaire. It's a standardized way of measuring certain disordered eating drives and is a scaled measure. What's important to note here is that you end up scoring it in these 5 sections: restraint, eating concern, shape concern, weight concern, and then a global score. All of these mean scores for these users were in the absolute highest percentile you can measure. So they all were in the 95th to 99th percentile. They were some of the highest scores that are reported on average for any study of any completely cachectic anorexic population in the literature, despite that these people had on average a normal BMI. They averaged 85.5 months of disease since their onset, but yet only 13% of our subjects had ever been in treatment, and only 9% had ever been medically hospitalized. Despite this, nearly 60% had been diagnosed with depression, 40% with anxiety, and about half of them had taken a psychiatric medication. So many of the users had been recognized to have some sort of psychiatric comorbidity, but they had never been in treatment for an eating disorder. We had really high incidence of concerning eating behaviors. So 77% had reported purging, 84% had binged, 53% had used laxatives, 71% had used diet pills, and nearly 80% had self-harmed. So those are really high incidences, higher than most in the literature. We also wanted to sort of create a timeline. So we asked like when their onset of these different behaviors were, because pro-eating disorder websites are often blamed for sort of making eating disorders contagious, that people will get an eating disorder from visiting these sites. And that may or may not be true, and our study does not prove that one way or the other. But one thing that was interesting when we asked about the onset of each specific kind of behavior they were reporting on, you see here that the mean age of onset for pro-ED usage was actually quite late in their disease course. So most people reported starting with dieting at a young age, then feeling that they developed into an eating disorder, as I said, around 14 years of age, then started to binge eat, then started to purge, then started using diet pills. If they sought treatment, that was usually what struck them to start treatment. And again, wide standard deviations of here, so you can't take too much from this. But then they would start with laxative use, and that's when pro-ED usage sort of came into play for many of them. We were also interested, as Dina talked about sort of how the level of pro-eating disorder website usage correlated with their EDEQ scores, so those scores of disordered eating that I mentioned before. And I see here that our asterisks are ludicrously small, so let me point out to you that basically for essentially every subscale and the global scale, and at each step, the ratings on the EDEQ were directly associated with the level of pro-ED website usage. So this being low usage, light amount of usage, medium amount of usage, and heavy amount of usage. And basically at each step, it was significant that you had a significant increase in your EDEQ score the more you use these sites. One other thing we've sort of discovered through doing both our pilot survey and this larger survey was that there's a real challenge, and Dina sort of mentioned this even in the content analysis, there's a huge challenge in overlapping usage, just like there's a challenge in the content analysis kind of work of overlapping content. So let me explain what I mean by that. When we did our pilot survey, we were naive. We had powered it to just sort of think that people would use these sites or they wouldn't. And that people who use these sites wouldn't use pro-recovery sites because they had totally different goals. And so that's what we thought. And we found that 36% of our patients visited pro-ED sites, 41% visited pro-recovery sites. But then if you look here, out of that, really many of the people who visited pro-ED or pro-recovery visited both. And then about half of our patients used neither type of site. So basically, if you were going online to get information or support or anything regarding your eating disorder, then you were often going to both types of site, or else you just weren't using the internet for that period. And basically, Harper et al. In 2007 also found that only 16% of the pro-ED users that she looked at purely used pro-ED websites. So often, and we all know this, right? I mean, it's now intuitive. I can't believe we were as naive as we were when we set this up. But when you go online, you're not just Googling one thing. Like, you're clicking on a bunch of things for anything you're looking up. And that's what these people do. Like, they go online, they put in a search term, and then they go to a bunch of sites. But that presents a little bit of an issue, because then basically, what's the harmful influence? Is it a pro-ED site? Is it a pro-recovery site? Is it a pro-self-injury site? Where is the harm coming from? Is there harm coming from one source? Is it harmful just to be on there a lot? What's the issue there? And we call that phenomenon poly-website use. What we found in the larger survey was that, similar to our smaller one, only 26.7% of our users, and keep in mind that for this survey, different from our clinical pilot study, we were only recruiting people who were visiting websites, like they would only see our survey if they were visiting a website that we had identified to have pro-ED content. But out of that population, only about a quarter of those subjects visited solely pro-ED websites, so were single users. Then we had dual users. We had about 40% of the subjects used either pro-ED websites and pro-recovery websites, or pro-ED websites and pro-self-injury websites. And then about a third were triple users, used all three kinds. And we looked to see whether there was a difference between people who used one type of site, 2, or 3, whether there was a difference in their reported post-visitation practices. So whether or not they use laxative diet pills or supplements after visiting these sites, weight loss or purging techniques after visiting these sites, or engaged in self-harm after visiting these sites. And again, we had significant differences, p less than 0.001, between each category in each subgroup. So if you were a single user, you were far less likely to use laxatives, diet pills, or supplements after visiting these websites than if you were a triple user. Same with self-harm and same with weight loss or purging. So we thought to ourselves, well, but with that dual user subgroup, maybe there is a difference between the people who visit ProED websites and pro-recovery websites versus those who visit ProED websites and pro-self-injury websites. We wanted there to be a difference there because we really want to think that these pro-recovery websites are helpful in some way. But in fact, there was no difference in most of the things we were looking at. The only differences we saw were that those who visited the self-injury websites as their dual use were a little bit younger, but not clinically significant. I wouldn't say 19.3 years of age versus 20 years of age. They were younger at the first time they visited a ProED website by about a year. They were more likely to have self-harmed, which is sort of a big whoop kind of finding. Like if they're visiting the pro-self-injury sites, I don't know that that really is so super surprising. And they're more likely to report depression. But otherwise, on any of the disordered eating measures, any of the post-visitation practices we were looking at, there were no differences between those subgroups. Pro-recovery sites did not appear to confer any protection. As Dina mentioned, there are sort of new directions coming all the time with this line of research. And so you can already, if you log onto Facebook and you search ProAna, there's tons of groups. Most of them are private. You usually have to prove your worth to get on them. So I don't recommend doing so. But from a research standpoint, it's a little more closed, those venues. YouTube has a ton of pro-anorexia and pro-bulimia videos, and those are fairly disturbing and graphic often. Twitter's coming out with a lot, and like Dina said, it's changing all the time. There may be some benefits to these sites, and that's sort of what we need to decide is how, if only 13% of our subjects have ever gotten treatment, yet they had such horrific EDEQ scores, then first of all, who are we as medical professionals missing? Why are they going to the internet instead of coming to us? And what the internet must be offering them some solace that we're not. So here are some quotes, and I have a few slides of quotes here that might indicate some reasons that people would go, because after this really long survey, they were generous enough to give us tons of qualitative data as well, and wrote like tomes about their reasons for visiting these sites, which was really helpful. So here someone says, they made me feel comfortable with the disease I have. They helped me lose weight in a healthier way. I would have an eating disorder with or without these sites. The sites just give me some comfort and hope. These are some more quotes from site users. People use ProAna sites because they feel included there. A lot of people put into therapy don't want to be there, and these sites are their only place to turn. Therapists should be more understanding of their patients' reluctance to recover and help them work through these feelings, rather than insisting on recovery or issuing threats if weight is not gained. I have been in numerous hospitals due to my illness and have met many people in there who blame ProAna sites not for their disorder, but for encouraging it, supporting it, allowing it to be okay. So a viewpoint on the other side. Therapists should try really hard to stop and think what life is like for their patients, put themselves in their sufferer's shoes, and then they may begin to understand why these sites are used. So again, you get sort of a feeling of that these sites offer empathy in a way that we as a professional community don't seem to. Just a few more. I remember telling my doctor that I was using them, and she seemed disgusted, like she was thinking how horrible it was to do that. The truth was I just felt so desperate to find others who thought exactly what I did. I first looked at a site to try to understand what was happening to me, what I was feeling, etc., as I didn't know what was going on. The most useful things I found were poems and memoirs of others who were suffering like I was. I was amazed to find that others felt exactly like me and found it helpful to read other people's ways of expressing themselves as I had not yet learned how to. And then someone who feels that they're dangerous. Pro-ana sites are dangerous to everyone. There are some interesting regulatory issues that these sites bring up. I'll just mention them quickly, but basically these come up with the web all the time. I'm sure you have to deal with these all the time, but we have to remember that what is illegal in the real world is still illegal in the virtual world. It's harder to capture people in the virtual world, but it's still illegal. And we do need to come up with some creative ways to safeguard children and vulnerable adults. There is a distinction from a regulatory standpoint between just the World Wide Web as a freestanding thing and sites with corporate owners. So Yahoo has issued restrictions. They have shut down some sites. Some of the ones owned by corporate owners have decided to do that. Some haven't. It's sort of an ongoing chase though, right? Because someone can just set up a new URL and start their site again immediately. In the US and Britain, there are regulations emerging for websites that collect info from minors, but those are really narrowly defined, usually as minors less than 13 years of age. And obviously, if you're a minor, you don't have to report that you're 13 years of age on any of these sites. You can lie. And if you're a website maintainer, you simply don't have to just target that population. So you sort of get around these issues. In France, there's some really interesting things that are still pending and have been pending for the last couple of years, but where there is a legislator that's proposed, and it's gotten to sort of the main council there, that anyone who perpetuates the quest for thinness online can get jail time and heavy, heavy fines. And that's problematic too from some of the things that Dina mentioned. I think we often try to vilify these sites, but really in actuality, I think these sites are often maintained by people who are reasonably ill. So that's one thing. And then B, they are usually co-opting content that is no different than what you can read in a Safeway grocery aisle. And so you can just look at Women's World Weekly or any of the magazines, Self-Shape, up and down the aisle, let alone going online, and you read all the same tips and tricks. It's just framed differently. There are some that are proposing that the models and stuff that are portrayed on these sites could sue for defamation, and that would be one way of keeping some of these things down. Again, none of this has been successful, but these are all issues that have been coming up. There's a constant recurring interest in these sites by the media. They are very interesting to them, and people are always calling for bans of these sites. I'm not of the mind that that's an easy thing or a productive thing to engage in. But what I can say for sure is that typically the media really trivializes these sites and have trouble covering the complexities. They do also perpetuate sort of this very concerning image of someone with anorexia or bulimia as someone who the disease has been a chosen disease, that it is contagious in this way, that it is self-inflicted in this way, when really we know it's a brain disorder, it's very damaging, and I don't, again, think that we should be blaming people for having an illness. So these are some headlines. This gets back to some of the ethical issues, just what is our duty when we care for people, who's harmed, who's vulnerable, how are they vulnerable. From a research perspective, there are ethical considerations I sort of alluded to, but there are a few studies that have gotten IRB permission to sort of lurk on the sites and pose as a site user rather than be upfront about their intention. Those are ethically concerning, and so basically encouraging lying. And then also just sort of how to study pro-ana versus pro-recovery sites, how to maybe really make sure that we're cautious about what sites we, as people that belong to institutions, put up, and make sure that they are truly helpful to people rather than harmful. In summary, ProED website usage is common in eating disorder populations. It seems to have an adverse impact on weight loss behaviors and body image. Whether or not that's causal is a whole different ballgame, but there are positive associations. The website users don't seem to fit conventional eating disorder stereotypes. Pro-recovery and professional website usage is also common and may not be protective. Poly website usage is a real emerging force, and we need to better understand the impact of sort of overall internet usage versus just one type. There are complex regulatory and ethical issues, and we constantly need to be thinking about why are people needing to go to these sites at all, and what can we be learning from them. When I talk to physicians and parents, I do try to remind them that young people are on the internet all the time, and that it is worth discussing the internet with them. It can be something that can be productive to discuss in therapy. I think a lot of physicians just stay away from even asking about it, and that we shouldn't prejudge. There's a spectrum of online risk behavior, just like there's a spectrum of in-person risk behavior, and this is just sort of an expression of that. I don't know that there are no evidence-based models for how to handle internet safety, but one just sort of common sense model is just to model it after the real world, in that if you're a parent and your kid is speaking to people you don't know and you've never met, doing it all at night when you're not around, that might not be such an awesome idea, that maybe you want to regulate it a little bit more than that. But obviously you've got to do it in a way that's congruent with your own parenting style. This is some artwork from one of the sites. All I wanted was to be a good girl. I want to thank everyone that's worked on this team, Dina especially, Jenny Wilson, Jim Locke, Iris Litt, Summer Shank, Dina already mentioned. Julia Mann was one of our youth consultants on these, Christina Hardy, who's now at Children's DC, and all the patients and website visitors that had just a ton of insight and help on this study. And I'm going to stop with just a poem from one of the sites. I've been asked by the author to introduce her in exactly this way. Her name is Melissa Cox. She's from Charleston, South Carolina, and she once had a severe eating disorder that caused her to have a heart attack, is now in recovery, and created a website designed for people like me who were once addicted to pro-ana websites and are now seeking recovery from their eating disorder. The poem is called Twisted Minds. Some look at us and call us crazy, how little they really know. They pass us by and stare like we're in some sickly show. Don't they see? It's not us who is at fault. They kill their bodies with fat and grease. But we give our bodies nothing at all. So you see, we really are the purest of the pure, nothing but skin and bones and a scale to reassure. So think about which one of us is on top next time you stop and stare, for we float in the realm of non-existence where all we need is air. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peebles and Dr. Borzakowski. At this point in the program, we will be taking questions both from our audience here live with us, as well as those online. Again, if you are watching online, just click on your send questions to presenters. So do we have any questions here to start with? Okay, we do have a question from our online audience, so I'll go ahead and start with that. This is actually from Canada. So from one of the slides you mentioned that the use of ProED sites was later in the disease progression, which began with dieting. I wondered how long ProED sites have been in use. Your sample who responded to the survey seemed to be older. Therefore, it makes sense that in their progression, the introduction of these sites should have been later, since the sites would not have been in existence. So perhaps a newer, younger person with eating disorders may be accessing the sites earlier due to the availability.
I think that's a great point, and I think it's certainly possible. We do know that these sites have been around since the 1980s for sure, but so since the advent of the internet, but obviously they're becoming more and more frequent, and I don't know that we can answer that question. I think it's a good point.
It's a very good point. Again, I think these sites have been around since the beginning of the internet, and these types of communities have been they emerged when the internet emerged. Same as with other difficult behaviors. You've seen these types of communities from the very start.
Okay. Anyone here have any questions for either presenter? Okay. Trying to get back to my inbox so I can see other questions, and it's not cooperating. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
With the study with the patients and parents,
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit about the demographics of the participants, what where in the country it was?
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mention that. It was done at Stanford University Medical Center. Um, they serve sort of a tri-state area, but for the most part, people are in sort of Northern California. And about 80%, 79 to 80% of the patients that they see, and this was reflected in the study, are Caucasian. About 9% Asian and 8% Hispanic. And then it sort of goes on from there. Sure. And those were adolescent patients, so age 12 to 19.
Okay. I'm sorry, this is taking a little bit.
I should mention, though, that there are a lot of IRBs that probably wouldn't have approved that study, to be honest, even though I think we did it in the best way possible, and that we always asked parents first about the study. We never recruited it from the kids, and we would explain what the websites were and stuff, but there would be many centers. We were lucky that Stanford allowed us to do that, and I'm sure that there was a bias of which parents decided to let their kids participate versus those who didn't.
Okay, we do have a question about what you would recommend for anyone who's treating an adolescent who has an eating disorder in terms of any advice on how to use these sites, whether to use these sites. You don't recommend banning or telling them they can't access them, but is there any way they can use them in helping their patients to recover?
I think yeah.
I don't think there are any easy answers there. I don't. When I was talking about I don't recommend banning them, I'm talking about in a sort of universal regulatory way. I think that's just a constant, never-ending chase that would suck our healthcare dollars away. But I don't at all mean that parents shouldn't be very involved in what their kids are accessing online. I'm a believer that they should be. I don't think there's a right answer to that. I don't even know what Dina believes on that. But and I think the parents, again, need to do that in a way that's congruent with their typical parenting style. So some people are going to be much more hands-off and some people are going to be much more hands-on. But as long as it's clear that they're involved, I think that's the most important thing. I do think parents of kids with eating disorders should be aware that these websites exist, and I think they should keep a closer eye out looking for them, because I do think that with this particular population, I think it can certainly, there's the possibility for more harm, I would imagine.
Right. I think that's one of the issues is, we can look at people who use these websites and get a sense of what's the impact from those who we already know go online. I think, exposing kids to these websites can be dangerous, and we really don't have that information about what do you do if you take the typical kid and expose them to this. Personally, I think it's probably not that harmful unless the kid's vulnerable to these issues anyway, or susceptible to these issues. That said, many kids are susceptible to these issues. There is one little interesting thing, though, that a lot of these websites, especially the pro-recovery ones, do, is they offer some bit of media literacy. And on around 13% of the websites, we found that there were, they offered information about how photographs are altered. And they showed that, in fact, some of these models are not real people, or they've been altered such that they, have thighs that are only twigs. And that's not really even what they are, but they've been altered pictures. So if you have a less susceptible kid, it might be of value to say, this is not a real person. They've been airbrushed in such ways.
And I think just like any risk behavior, I just think we should view the internet as sort of a possible risk behavior the same way we do about smoking and everything else. So it's a great tool for a lot of information, but it can be a tool for inducing risk. And as a result, we should at least just have open dialogues with kids, both as providers and parents, in the same way we would about sexuality or drug use or anything else.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Just wondering if you could speak a
you could repeat the question so our online audience can hear.
Oh, you want me to repeat it? Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I'd be happy to repeat it. So it was, she's asking if I can speak to why the EDEQ scores were higher in this population than in other reported populations. I want to be clear that it wasn't so much that they were higher, they were as high as some of the highest ones reported in the literature. And I think we don't do enough. I don't have an answer for why that is, but what I can say is that there's certainly not enough literature looking at how disordered eating behaviors and thoughts exist among the walking wounded, like the people that you're not picking up off the street for looking enormously malnourished, but just people who look like they're at a normal weight or a heavy weight. We don't always ask them, we don't always screen, and I think that means that we don't have a lot of answers, but certainly it appears that this group, while they weren't someone that physically would have popped out at me, they had really concerning thoughts and behaviors.
Okay. There is another question from online. In your practice, do you find that persons with eating disorders are willing to view websites that promote healthy eating habits? Do you refer the savvy persons to websites with healthier viewpoints that encourage healthy habits?
That's a good question. Have you ever done that?
Well, I haven't, because healthy eating habits are so distorted by people with eating disorders typically that it's not a very safe or helpful thing to discuss. And usually what's more important to discuss is why they're so obsessed with the idea of really only focusing on eating and weight regardless. They're also, so no, I don't refer to any specific websites is the answer to that question.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I think that wraps us up for today. Thank you all for coming and for logging in, and thank you very much to Dr. Borzakowski and Dr. Peebles for being here with us today. And we'll see you next month. Thank you.